Welcome to our Interdisciplinary Dialogue Series, Restorative Justice in the Built Environment. The series holds conversations among community leaders, practitioners, scholars, reflecting on the relationship between restorative justice and built environment disciplines from the perspective of historically disenfranchised communities. I am Clara Irazabal, professor and Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer at the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, University of Maryland, College Park. I thank Hannah Cameron, co-organizer of the series, Dean Jordan and her office, and our communications and IT teams for their support of this series. I also thank the speakers who graciously share their wisdom with us. As an offering from the school's JEDI collaborative, this series is composed of 4 dialogue sessions. They take place in the context of a community planning studio course, working with and for the Lakeland community, a historic African-American community neighboring our university campus that both our university and city are collaborating with in efforts to restore justice. The dialogue series asks, what is restorative justice? How is this type of justice different from other modes of justice? How does or can it manifest itself in the built environment? This is the 3rd in the dialogue series. And this session is called Examining Gentrification, Displacement, and Racial Capitalism through a Restorative Justice Lens. It asks, what engenders justice or injustice, and to whom in context of gentrification, displacement, and racial capitalism? Can justice be restored within those contexts? And if so, how and by whom? If not, how can we conceive of the built environment and the practices that produce it otherwise? Our hope is that the dialogue helps us plant good seeds in the soils of our spatial disciplines from where restorative justice can flourish. I now introduce Brittany Wong, a PhD candidate in the school. She will be introducing the speakers and moderating this 3rd dialogue. Brittany.
Hello and welcome. So thank you all for coming to this dialogue session. So today we have an amazing panel. Like Dr. Irazabal said, they'll be examining gentrification, displacement, and racial capitalism through a restorative justice framework. So I'm Brittany Wong, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Urban and Regional Planning and Design program at MAPD. And my research lies at the intersection of environmental psychology, human geography, and urban planning, and focuses on people-place relationships within the context of gentrification and displacement. So as the moderator today, I'll be guiding us through this dialogue, and we have a short period of time, it's only an hour, so the session will proceed as follows. We'll start by introducing the speakers, and the speakers will each give an introductory 4-minute presentation. After the presentations, I will begin the dialogue by asking the speakers a couple of questions related to the topic of this session. Then the respondents will continue the dialogue by asking their own questions to the speakers. And if there is any time remaining, we will take questions from the other attendees who submit their questions to the chat. So before we start, I'm going to go through some housekeeping items really quickly. For the virtual attendees, please make sure that you keep your microphone muted unless you are presenting or asking a question. For the in-person attendees, please keep your masks on unless you are presenting or asking a question. And for the virtual and in-person speakers, if you could just please raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and then I could call on you and give you the floor. Okay, so without further delay, I'll jump right into the introductions. So we'll start with Dr. Alvaro Huerta. He is an associate professor in urban and regional planning and ethnic and women's studies at Cal Poly Pomona. He teaches and conducts research on the intersecting domains of community and economic development, Chicano and Latino studies, immigration and Mexican diaspora, social movements, and social networks and the informal economy. Next, we have Dr. Margaret Marietta Ramirez. She is an assistant professor of geography at Simon Fraser University. Her work explores intersections between racial capitalism and settler colonialism in cities across the Americas and how the creative geographies of marginalized peoples are policed, co-opted, and resisted in gentrifying cities. We also have Dr. Laura Harjo, who is a Muskogee scholar and an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma. Her research and teaching centers on Indigenous planning, community development, and Indigenous feminisms. And lastly, we have Dr. Georgianne Matthews, who's an assistant professor of architecture here at UMD in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She's also an alumna of MAPD programs, a Master of Architecture and Urban Planning PhD programs. In addition to teaching architecture and urban design, she has been active in the profession with projects focusing on public architecture and community planning. So we have a well-rounded group of panelists today, and so I'm going to just jump right into the presentations. Hannah will be keeping time, and each of you have 4 minutes to present. So look to her for a 1-minute warning. We'll start with Dr. Huerta.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if it's tardes or noches. I'm not good with that stuff, but I think it's tardes. So I really appreciate the welcome. This is like the Oscars. I know that my time already started and the music is going to start, so I'm just going to jump right in. I really appreciate the framework, the JEDI. I love that framework that is, I'm going to steal it and I'll give credit. This idea of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, this is 100% what I believe in, and I really appreciate everything that you all do at your fine university. I belong to what Veblen referred to as a servant class over 100 years ago. You know, my mother was a domestic worker. My father was a janitor, both Mexican immigrants. You know, so this is who I am. I think when we speak, we have to know and present ourselves openly so that we understand like where we're coming from. You know, I grew up in housing projects. My brother was in a gang. I experienced police abuse with being pulled over, guns pulled at me. Attended the worst public university, the worst public schools in the country, in K to 12. But at the same time, I attended the best, public universities in the world. So I have this insider-outsider perspective on this. To me, it all starts, with urban planning. It has to do, a simple definition, it has to do with the relationship between people and place. That's really what it comes down to. And what's key to me is that not all people experience place in the same way, given our racial identities, our sexualities, our religion, and different identities that comprise who we are. Not only as individuals, but the communities we belong to in terms of class and racial identities and so on and so forth. I truly believe in, and you might regret inviting me, because at the end of the day, I really don't believe in the system that we operate under. And I must quote, Audre Lorde, that argues, and I know she's often quoted, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So what does that mean? It means to me that whatever they teach us at these fine universities, I attended UCLA and UC Berkeley, they are not going to teach us the tools to destroy that elitist system that perpetuates inequality in America, especially against brown people, against Black people, against indigenous people, Asians, Pacific Islanders, and so on and so forth. So we must look and create and imagine a better world, because the world that we have is unjust. And a lot of times in terms of injustice, when it comes to police abuse, is just us, Black and brown people and indigenous in particular. I also believe in this idea of interdisciplinary learning and teaching. And I always refer to Paulo Freire, the brilliant Brazilian educator and philosopher, one of the most brilliant minds who have ever existed. And he writes and talks about this idea of true generosity and false generosity. So a lot of times in our actions as leaders, as scholars, as students, as community activists, I was a community activist before I became a scholar, looking at the difference between these two ideas, and true generosity aims to transform the world versus false generosity, which amounts to charity. And a lot of times when people and institutions engage in charity, they believe that they're actually changing the world, but they're not. So the difference between transforming the world and reforming it. So having a Black president didn't change anything for Black people. Over 2 million people in this country are incarcerated, the majority Black and brown, and those that are white are working class and oppressed as well. And when Obama left office, we had the same amount. So it's not about the color, the face of who we are as individuals and the color in our colors and our identities. It's about the system, and we need to look at transforming the system and not accepting the system that we believe that we have if we don't believe in it. Because change will not come from within, it has to come from without. So those of us who are privileged, who are educated, who speak English, like my parents didn't speak English, 50 years in this country, my dad like screwdriver, my mom, she just knew yogurt, that's it, 50 years. So those of us that speak English, that's a privilege. So we have to use our privilege for the benefit of los de abajo, the marginalized, the dispossessed. And accept our privilege and not be ashamed of it, but it's what we do with it. You know, a lot of times people get into this colorism and divide Black and brown people. I don't care if you're Black, I don't care if you're white, I don't care if you're Asian. That has nothing to do with anything. It's what you do with that privilege. In the service of whom? In terms of what class? And for me, I believe in this idea of class suicide. Even though I belong to the educated class, I don't want to represent that class. I want to represent my parents, you know, the people that were left behind in the project, the ones that went to jail, the ones that, you know, were engaged in activities of self-destruction because the system itself perpetuated and created the conditions for Black and brown people to kill themselves. And it's only an epidemic when it comes to drugs or anything, when it's white people are affected. When Black and brown people are dying of crack cocaine or anything of that nature, it's not a problem. But now we have opiate crisis. All of a sudden now it's a crisis because white kids are dying and overdosing in Ohio. So this is like the racial disparities that I see from above and from below. And for those of us who come from these communities, is to be able to code switch and not forget where we came from and who is it that we're serving. And this idea of now that we're the special word, we're like, oh, you're one of the good ones, Alvaro. But they actually changed my name, Alberto. And to reject that as well, because the idea is like, if they don't invite one of us, if they don't invite all of us, then none of us should go to the party. I mean, you go to a Mexican party, there's like quinceañera or whatever, you know, you have kids are involved in it, and the whole family comes with us. And a lot of times to get into these elite universities, to get into America, to be successful, they only want you as an individual, as a token. So I think the hand is up, the Oscar music is coming up. But I just want to say that I really appreciate being invited. And after this, you're probably not going to invite me again. But like we say, in East LA, once again, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Huerta. Let's have Dr. Ramirez go next.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. What a pleasure to follow Dr. Huerta. Thank you for starting us off with thinking about Freire and true generosity. I really appreciated you reminding us of Freire's work. So thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be in conversation and dialogue with you all today. I'm calling in from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories north of the colonial border here in the settler city of Vancouver, BC. I've been living on these territories for 3 years now, and while I'm building connections and beginning to better understand the particular struggles and the particular geographies of these lands, I still really situate much of my thinking and organizing from Ohlone territories where I was born and raised. So I know while we've been prompted to address the themes of today's conversation from our respective disciplines, I'm actually not going to be speaking from human geography per se, but rather be speaking in relation to different movements that exist in the San Francisco Bay Area. So when I read the title of this panel and what we're reflecting on today, I thought first about the work of Courage, the organization that stands for Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice, that's based in Oakland, California. Now, Courage is an organization led by formerly incarcerated Latinx people that create restorative healing spaces for formerly incarcerated youth, as well as advocate for policy change on the state level to reform the criminal justice system. When I first spoke to the founder of Courage, George Galvis, back in 2015, I was interested in the ways that Courage used storytelling to reveal the connections between policing in Oakland and urban displacement. I was struck by how clearly Galvis saw the implementation of gang injunction zones in Oakland in 2009 as having an end goal of displacing Black and Latinx residents from their neighborhoods, fueling gentrification. As Galvis explained to me, quote, "The policing isn't about public safety as it is about bulldozing and displacing communities of color, about making them uncomfortable enough to want to move and to make room for the gentry to come in," end quote. So where I see Courage's work speaking to today's theme is in how restorative justice practices can respond to the ways that the state repeatedly abandons, dispossesses, and incarcerates minoritized communities in North America, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As Galvis sees it, retaining cultural spaces in neighborhoods is a necessary part of enacting restorative justice principles, where formerly incarcerated people can come together to heal and to build alternatives within these systems that perpetuate dispossession. So access to land and communal spaces is thus an essential piece of restorative justice frameworks. In the context of cities undergoing housing crises like Oakland, this also means retaining a foothold in neighborhoods that low-income residents are being priced out of. This is true for many organizations and collectives that are organizing on Ohlone territories, from Eastside Arts Alliance's Cultural Center, which is a key hub for community arts programming and activist organizing in East Oakland, to the Segurite Land Trust, an Indigenous woman-led organization facilitating the return of tracts of land to Ohlone stewardship across Oakland and the greater East Bay. So land is thus a key component in organizing against dispossession and organized abandonment. Access to safe and stable housing, to food, and spaces in which you can practice cultural traditions, arts, and ceremony are essential and intertwined components of what restorative justice looks like. The Segurite Land Trust teaches what land back means in practice at the neighborhood scale, demonstrating how returning land to Indigenous stewardship is a significant way that restorative justice practices can be implemented, creating spaces that are accessible to people working towards common futures that are also governed by Indigenous protocols. So when I think about what it means to practice restorative justice in gentrifying cities, to me, it comes down to access to space and to land. City governments need to be supporting organizations that are meeting the immediate needs of its residents by providing sustainable access to space in gentrifying neighborhoods, to ensure that the services they provide endure so that low-income residents can also endure the instability of the times that we're living in. And ideally, cities should be working collaboratively with the nations whose territories the city occupies to return land to Indigenous stewardship. I wonder if then land back is in itself a form of restorative justice. For if to return land to Indigenous stewardship truly attends to the ongoingness of colonialism in the settler colonial city, it thus allows for more expansive and accessible visions of the city to emerge. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Ramirez. It was great hearing your interpretation of restorative justice. So next we'll go and hear from Dr. Harjo.
Thank you. Yeah, so Laura Harjo, Shaha Chipkidos, Yaha Halogi, Amalegidos, Tuskegee Amatowados, Sukarjo Tate Moman Ellen Harjo, Judge Kogetawagas. Hello, my name is Laura Harjo. I am Wolf Clan. I am from Tuskegee Tribal Town, or Italwa. and my parents are the late Duke Harjo and Ellen Harjo. So I come this way of letting you hear my Muskogee language, and I'm coming from the stolen lands of Muskogee Treaty homelands. So I'll go ahead and start. So around the turn of the century in the early 1900s, the state of Oklahoma, they were in the middle of an oil boom. And just a decade or so earlier, the Dawes Act had been initiated, and that consisted of taking large collectively held tribal land bases of indigenous nations, parceling them into individually owned allotments. And the idea was that within 25 years, Native folks would probably lose that land. The other aspect of that was to assimilate Native folks and to keep them locked in place. So the idea of not having folks out hunting the land, traipsing around on the land where there were going to be settlers, so the idea of containing folks. So what this resulted in was that for some Muskogee people, it generated wealth because we were in an oil boom. And for others, it created stolen wealth, lives, and land. The city of Tulsa, and that's the area I'm talking about, the city of Tulsa has grown on oil money at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and people of color land. And today it still sustains itself on oil. Conversely, the site of Tulsa is actually a Muskogee geography of emergence. So after our displacement from the southeastern United States, Lochapoja tribal town, or Idalwa, found a spot on a high hill that overlooked the river next to an oak tree, and they sanctified the ground there, and they created a new ceremonial and governance space for Muskogee people. And the name Tulsa is actually after a Muskogee word, but you would never know that. So today, the council oak tree, it still stands at the park. There's a large metal sculpture that looks like a flame. There's a stickball park, and nearby there's a larger park and a commercial district that's underutilized. So I just want to say, when I come to this idea of restorative justice, I mean, I sort of have a problem with it because to me, it's not something that I could ever see being carried out as a reciprocal relationship, that if BIPOC folks want restorative justice, it's going to have to be something that is not a two-way street. Because even here in Oklahoma, tribes were giving out COVID shots to everybody, but on the same vein, people aren't as willing to be as kind to tribal folks. So when I come to restorative justice, I think of an Indigenous feminist framework. What does it mean to be a good relative? How are you accountable to your ancestors? How are you accountable to your relatives now and in the future? So when I'm thinking about this space of Tulsa, I have several calls around that. I don't call it restorative justice. I call it being in good relations or relational accountability. So surfacing the history around Black Wall Street, Muskogee land teaching, laying aside settlement areas for our former tribal towns or awakening our tribal towns, providing land and a place for our settlement, developing an Italwa or tribal town space within the city of Tulsa, centering Indigenous women and girls in the design of the city and the space, programming for all, and then ideas around witnessing, gendering, and intervening, and imagining what that could look like. So that's sort of my framing of restorative justice. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harjo. That was a very interesting take on it as well. I'm sort of kind of analyzing and thinking about your perspective, and also Dr. Ramirez's perspective, and thinking about Dr. Huerta's, and sort of just thinking about how there's some overlaps with that. But we'll go on and hear from our last speaker, Dr. Matthews. If you want to go ahead and give us your introduction.
Here, I'm fine.
You're
Speak here.
fine, yeah.
Okay, so I'm coming from the practice of
There.
architecture and I look here, look here,
Yes,
slides there,
yeah.
okay.
They don't
So-
follow you.
All right, so, and we show slides because that's what we do. I'm a native Washingtonian. I'm going to just show you a project that I am currently working on. That is the hometown and neighborhood of my ancestors, my grandmother, my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandfather, Edge Hill, Nashville. This is a fort, and that fort was held by Union soldiers, built by slaves, known as contraband because they didn't have legal status. And they fled the South to areas like this, and they built lots of towns in the South. Edge Hill is a neighborhood that was then established by this community. Go to the next slide. Is it frozen? Oops.
Oh, we can't see it, the slides.
Yeah.
They can't see them?
Yeah.
Okay, you can see them? Okay, and then the next slide just shows the typical architecture, clapboard houses, craftsman bungalows. And this is a community that established deep roots, deep care networks, professional expertise, doctors and lawyers, community members who took care of one another. And so the third slide, if you ever get to it, is going to show what's happening now. So that's the history, and you see entrepreneurship, you see retail ownership, you see dollars circulating in the community over and over and over again. And now the house to the left is actually next door to a house that I owned in Nashville, where I lived with my 2 children when I got a divorce. And I bought that house from an older woman who said, baby, if you want this house, I'm going to make it happen. So we worked it. I sold a car. I put the down payment on a credit card, and that's how I got my first house. And that's what happens in neighborhoods and communities where people care about each other. That monstrosity to the right is what is happening now. So in architecture, we see it like on the front lines. This is upzoning to the extent that the taxes on the smaller ranch house are $12,000 a year. So you can imagine people in this community who have paid for houses that they've inherited from mama and grandmom, and now they can't afford the taxes twice a year, $6,000. I don't know, you guys probably have student loans and you have tuition payments, but that is a heft and people are losing their homes. So this is structural racism and inequity happening. That's downtown Nashville. These are neighborhoods that are in the first ring of downtown. So they are hot, they are sexy. This is what everybody wants. I can't say that I've seen the written plan to remove people from these neighborhoods, but I see it happen every single day. Next slide. So what are we doing? I have a small little pro bono community design center. William Edmondson lived in this neighborhood. He had a 3rd grade education, could barely read, but his artwork, these little headstones were featured in MoMA. He's the first African-American to have a solo exhibit there at the same time as Pablo Picasso. Next slide. He was not even able to see his own work because he wasn't allowed in the building. So we are leveraging as a community, and I'm saying we, all I'm doing is doing schematic design for this neighborhood. These are community leaders. These are the grandmothers in the community in conjunction with business leaders who are trying to figure out how to stop displacement. I don't know if the train has already left the station, but this is a schematic sketch of the last open space in Nashville, of an adaptive reuse of a library building it's a middle school, and turning it into a library, a community center, a place for workforce training, et cetera, to kind of marshal the community and get their energy on board for activism. Next slide. And I think this is the final one. Okay. So what does, to me, restorative justice look like? As a practitioner and kind of a community activist, I'm not as sophisticated as some of the speakers. I'm a new teacher, but it's like, how do you arm people in the community with the tools to fight back? That sketch and the series of designs that we have done of that library have been shown to the mayor, have been shown to other people who are interested in that site. And because William Edmondson is an historic figure, we've had that large 25-acre site designated an historic landmark, which means developers can't grab it. And that provides a little bit of safety for the neighborhoods around it. Yeah, and at community meetings, people are learning, like, what are our tools? That's it. Did I do 4 minutes? I'm done. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, and that thing on that is Fort Negley, which was built by the slaves. That is a visitor center. The firm that I worked for designed the visitor center. It's a minority woman-owned firm. And so it's block by block, building by building, where you kind of save neighborhoods. Thank you.
Great. So thank you all for giving us an introduction to your work and your perspectives and providing some context as we move into the dialogues we have here. So to start off, most of you already gave sort of your own definition of restorative justice from the perspective of your own research. I think the only person who might have gone a little bit who didn't really do that would be Dr. Huerta. And I was wondering if you could just sort of speak more on that. What is your definition of restorative justice and how does it relate to the definitions that we've heard so far from the other speakers?
I agree 100% with what was said. Part of it is that there's like a harm has been done, and so how can we address that harm? Right? And the system doesn't allow for it to be truly addressed. So in the case of African Americans, it would be like reparations and more, right? In terms of Native Americans, it would just give the land back. There's no question about that. I've always criticized how institutions and universities, say like Black Lives Matter. Like when Coca-Cola says Black Lives Matter, there's a problem because the movement is being co-opted. So I think in terms of our language or like when we have at the university, we talk about like what land we're occupying is a lot of times is very symbolic. So the way I see restorative justice is I try to argue that we need to see it outside of capitalism. So the way it's defined is within the system itself, in terms of having some type of justice to the injured or to those that have been harmed in terms of like relationships and trust and community and repair and so on and so forth. So for me, I feel like that we need to go beyond that and look at more like what's the value system of the system that we have and replace it with one that's more just and is more in harmony with the land, with Mother Earth, because what we have right now is not sustainable. And to use language that it gets away from reform and more into like transformation of society in the relationships, and that we don't accept capitalism as it is and try to create friendly capitalism or capitalism with a smile, because it ends up doing more harm than good. Because we still, if we operate within this framework of restorative justice within capitalism, you cannot fix the system. You would only allow it to continue because you're reforming it and giving dissidents. You're giving those radical voices like they're being co-opted and maintaining the system and the status quo as it is. So I just reject it altogether and do not feel that not the term and the people that advocate for it, but within that system, that any type of framework that perpetuates capitalism, I'm against. And that we need to be careful in terms of like using with Lord what she talks about those tools that are given to us or that we learn within the system. They're not aimed to overturn it. They're more aimed to reform it and make it more pleasant. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not answering the question, but I just feel that in terms of the speakers, I'm in 100% in agreement with everything, and I look at it more like in terms of value systems and systems. which
Mhm.
I don't think it contradicts.
Yeah, no, I think your explanation of how you see it relates a little bit to Dr. Harjov's sort of understanding that seeing it as restorative justice as a problem, right? Like, you mentioned that you can't see it as a reciprocal process. So I think Dr. Huerta's response to that and seeing restorative justice as sort of being outside of capitalism because it currently exists within capitalism. I think that relates to Dr. Harjov's sort of understanding of that. And so I was wondering if you could speak more and sort of, I guess, respond to Dr. Huerta's understanding of restorative justice and how that sort of plays out a little bit more in gentrifying cities. Dr. Harjo?
Sorry, I didn't hear you say my name. I was like, oh, I'm chilling. Someone's gonna answer. Okay, I'm sorry. Can you restate that? Respond to Dr. Huerta in terms of.
So I was seeing some connections with his explanation of restorative justice through his lens of it sort of being within capitalism and needing to see it outside of capitalism. So that relates to your understanding of not really being able to see restorative justice as a reciprocal process, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of needs to happen outside of capitalism as well. It sort of needs to be taken out of the whole sort of context and just sort of placed back out there, start fresh. So I was wondering if you could just comment on his understanding of that, and then talk more about how it would relate to indigenous populations in gentrifying cities.
Okay. Yeah, so like when I presented my 4 minutes, all of that was really to say that restorative justice can't be, that I cannot see where restorative justice can be found within the politics of recognition, because you're still asking the one that is injuring to have grace towards you, and they can KMA. Sorry, I know that's not scholarly, but to me, it's like, then how do you how do the people not wait for the colonizer, the oppressor? They don't wait on them to respond or to do caretaking. They do the caretaking themselves. So when I'm talking about all of these different things I would like to see in Tulsa, then the way that I imagine it is kind of like, just let us have this space and we'll go from there. So if we want to figure out our own sort of alternative economy type of system and put that in place within our sort of tribal town or Italwa, a modern day Italwa, what would a modern day Italwa look like? And I actually had my students work on that in for Atlanta, because they want to build something called Cop City at something called Wilani Forest. So in terms of gentrifying though, if we look at that area where Council Oak Tree is, there are actually very expensive homes there. And just adjacent to that, there are these sort of unused lots, underutilized space. And in my mind, I'm plotting on it. I'm like, how can we sit and imagine an Italwa in our Italwa? Because I see Tulsa as that's our relative. And like, folks aren't even imagining that was ever even Muskogee space, but it has a Muskogee name. So for me, what would it look like to kind of stake this place and have Muskogee people there, and have Muskogee housing, and have a sovereignty school, and have a bartering system or trading kind of economy in place? So, I mean, what would it look like? So to me, I'm imagining, I guess, Muskogee futurity in the city as, I'm not calling it restorative justice, because to me, that's the politics of recognition. I mean, if others want to work in that, that's cool. I don't have any problem with that. But for Muskogee people, I just don't see that as kind of an avenue, and I see it more enshrined within the kinship networks and the embodied knowledge and resources that individuals carry within them to create the things that we want to see, and not to wait on anybody or wait on permission from anybody. And, you know, to be frank, my students on a daily basis, they really grapple with the situation here in Oklahoma, that it's like Indigenous folks are looked at as less than human, and they keep wanting to figure out a way to repair that relationship. And I hurt for them because they hurt, because they want that. And I want to tell them, forget about it, just keep moving and build something for yourself. But I know that that's part of restorative justice. And again, it's the idea of like invoking the injurer to be a better whatever to the injured party. And I just don't see that happening with the state of things where we are right now. So yeah, that's my 2 words.
Thank you for expanding on that. It's really interesting to hear about that. And, you know, just digging deeper into the topic, the next question I have is what engenders injustice, and to whom in context of gentrification, displacement, and racial capitalism? And I'm going to throw this to Dr. Ramirez first, and then have Dr. Matthews follow up. So go ahead.
Thanks. So the question is, what engenders injustice?
Yes, what engenders injustice, and to whom in context of gentrification, displacement, and racial capitalism?
That's a big question. I mean, I think it's all the things that we've already touched upon, right? Like, especially if we're thinking about cities in the frame as existing within, you know, histories and geographies of racial capitalism, and also settler colonialism. And as Dr. Huerta and Dr. Harjo and others have already pointed out, you know, time and time again, we see the same populations being dispossessed, both within the system of capitalism and also in terms of the colonial project. So injustice, in my mind, is just how we, again, see these same patterns, see the same people sort of bearing the brunt of extraction and exploitation under capitalism and under colonialism. And so therein, you know, if we're talking within frameworks of what is then social justice or restorative justice, or whatever framework you want to use, sort of look like, it is, you know, righting those wrongs that have been happening over generations, but in a material sense as well. So I think it really resonated with what Dr. Harjo said about, you know, how they're sort of implied in the frame of restorative justice of being a reciprocal relationship, and how she said it's not going to be a two-way street, right? And so really it's about, like what I was sort of implying in my initial comments, is about, you know, cities or those with access to capital, just, you know, helping people retain a foothold in their neighborhoods, in their communities, on their lands, financially or through material resources or through land, and doing their own thing, not sort of expecting something in exchange from that. So that to me would be sort of, you know, if a quote unquote just response to generations, you know, centuries of injustice.
Okay. I agree with Dr. Ramirez. Injustice and the perpetrators and the same people sort of being the recipient of similar behavior generation after generation. I'm a native Washingtonian, which used to be known as Chocolate City, and it was 70% African American, and it's now about 47%. And change always happens, but when you look sort of structurally about how that happens and who has access to capital to either stay or build, it's quite clear that there are some injustices that keep reappearing among my friends, many women of color, some who are in this very building. We know that when you're applying for a mortgage, you don't show your face. You do it over the phone. When you're looking to buy a house in a certain neighborhood that is gentrifying in Washington, D.C., you don't go to the house and you don't bring your children. You apply for the mortgage incognito. And I am an assistant professor here, and I have some education, and I think I'm smart-ish. And I've, built myself to a certain point, but there are still those things that happen in the world. That is an injustice. If I have to go to 7 mortgage brokers with the same package and same credit as another neighbor, and we talk to neighbors who don't look like myself, and we compare, and we know that these things exist. So I'm kind of rambling, but to me that is injustice, and we see it cyclically. So as long as the city was kind of a place where no one wanted to be, and it had a certain reputation, certain communities are left alone. But when it becomes part of the capitalist system and agenda, it becomes very difficult to stay there and to get in the first place. Hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. So it's interesting to hear from your perspective as a native Washingtonian, and living through and seeing how DC has changed demographically, but also economically too as well. And it shows the drivers of gentrification and seeing how capitalism has really played a large role in that. So next, we'll move on to hearing from our respondents. We were supposed to have a Lakeland resident, but I believe that that person is not here today, but we do have other residents on the call or with us. So hopefully if they have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we can get to them after we address the students' questions here. So we do have a master's student enrolled in the community planning studio this semester, and they will be asking you all a question. So if that person can go ahead and introduce themselves, and then ask your question, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria. I'm a student in the Restorative Justice Studio, and I'm a community planning and architecture student here at UMD. And I wanted to ask if you have examples where displacement has happened and it has been compensated properly. Is there a way to compensate displacement, or what aspects should be taken into consideration when displacement is necessary, or if there's a way to avoid it completely?
Yeah, I can answer that up. I don't think that in the cases of displacements that the compensations has been adequate. I mean, this is an old example, but it's very resonant. Is the case of Chavez Ravine, when during urban renewal in Los Angeles, a place was identified as blighted, which is Mexican American and Mexican immigrants. And the city took over it using eminent domain, and they were going to build public housing. Then the land got sold to, eventually got sold to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and now we have Dodger Stadium. My aunt is buried in Third Base, so I don't know, every time I go. And when when they got kicked out, those that were owners, they were compensated through this eminent domain at market value. And that's really how it works. And within the system that we operate under. So this is why I'm against it, is that, so they were like, okay, we're going to give you $8,000 because that's the market rate. And there's an excellent documentary on this. So when one family took that $8,000, they realized that the dad thought he cashed in, because that's a lot of money back then. And then all of a sudden, we're like in 1940s, 50s. All of a sudden, he tries to buy a home in another part of the city, Lincoln Heights, where I went to high school. And the houses were not $8,000. Now they were $12,000, $18,000, so on and so forth. Right? So whatever is given to our people that are renters or homeowners in terms of compensation, that doesn't translate in the market. You know, we see this in displacement when another example, and I hate to pick on sport because I love sports. This saved me from joining the gang. You know? Actually, I didn't join the gang because I was too skinny, but that's another story. It's like therapy for me. When they displaced the people to build a Staples Center, and now it's Crypto Center with the house of Kobe Bryant, the Lakers, there were like 200 families that were displaced. And they probably gave them like $20,000 or something like that. But from them paying like $600 a month to now, at that time, you know, we're talking now 1,200, 1,800. So how long would that money is going to run out? So there is like these band-aid solutions and within the law that gives some compensation, but it's not, it does more harm than good because they cannot find the same place. And it's also what they're disrupting. They're not only disrupting people's land and them be occupying a home, whether they're renters or homeowners. I mean, I grew up in housing projects, and so we were on welfare and we were poor. But what they're doing is they're also disrupting community. And that's more important. You know, that's literally more important. I mean, that's the only reason I didn't go get a job at Harvard. Not that they were going to hire me, because I didn't want to relocate my son from his community, from his friends. And that's, to me, as a Mexican of indigenous roots, that's more important. You cannot compensate that, to disrupt community and the relationships among the people that they depend on to survive, right?
Can I jump in, Maria? And I completely agree with Professor Huerta. Displacement, once it's happened, I haven't, in my experience, seen restorative justice. I think as planners and as architects, I hope that we can marshal our efforts to making sure displacement doesn't happen. And so there are lots of tools that you guys have in your classes and your studios when you do these sort of area analyses, and you look at master planning and you look at what's coming down the pipe, the 10-year plan for the city. A lot of people who live in community don't know these things. And so that's what I've started doing. Is you know, metros are great things, but you know, metro stops coming in. It's not great for the community. So tell people that a new school is being developed, a new metro stop is coming, show them the master plan, show them what the city is projecting for their neighborhood. And so they know they've got 5 years, maybe 10 years to get together as a community and see what they can do to mitigate the damage.
Do any of the other speakers want to answer that question? If not, we can move on to a question in the chat. Okay, we have a question from Kitty Dyson. She wants to know if gentrification is the next generation of urban renewal.
I can try to respond to that. I mean, I would argue that I don't think we can let sort of the limits of these sort of linear timeframes sort of help us make sense of what's going on at the present. I think Ananya Roy does really important work around framing this current moment of you know, housing crises as racial banishment, and just pointing us towards, you know, these longer histories of how time and time again the same people are being dispossessed of their lands in particular ways, right? So I would argue that, you know, urban renewal and gentrification are sort of subsets or, you know, mechanisms or techniques or tools, however you want to frame it, for, you know, dispossession under racial capitalism and settler colonialism. So it's just another means of, accumulating wealth and extracting value, if you're gonna talk in, capitalist terms.
Does anyone else want to take a stab at answering that question? Okay, we have one more question in the chat here. Let's see, it's from Robert Thurston. He asks, is planning or government the space to identify overall impacts on community when most communities are at best are presented individual property purchased changes?
Can you read that again?
Is planning or government the space to identify overall impacts on community when most communities at best are presented individual property purchased changes? Let's see. Robert, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and clarify your question, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Very good information. Thank you very much. I'm a actual Lakeland resident. And my question is based on what was kind of just the conversation has been around. With restorative justice in mind, the capitalism piece is what my base on the question is you mentioned planning has a lot of resources, 10-year plan, those things like that. But from a community standpoint, we only hear about a property once it's purchased and they're planning to do something significantly different with it. We've had situations where a family home has been supposedly rebuilt, but it was rebuilt with 9 units inside of it. So it's really not a house, it's a rental home. And these are, I think, signs that come before major changes happen, but they come kind of bit by bit. And by the time there is a significant change in community, as others have said, there's been so much loss, where is that place now going to be? So the question goes back to who best could prevent that? Is it the planner who has the opportunity to see all these things coming, the metro development at our doorstep, or is it government that needs to say this community is going to stay a community regardless of what? Or maybe it's both.
Okay, really good question, Robert. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at, that it's often too late to address displacement if you don't arm people in the community with sort of the tools, the master plan, and then you give them time to come up with a strategy. I think classes like this, so I do believe that there is restorative justice. I don't think it happens 10 years later or 100 years later. Fingers crossed that we all get whatever we do, but I think it's finding out what communities actually want and need. We have speakers here today representing various communities, and then having planners as sort of facilitators in preserving the community. So I think planning doesn't come from the government per se for how to save a particular community. It comes as a partnership. And I think courses like this, I think if University of Maryland ends up having a design center where we go into the community and work with them and lend our expertise so that they can then save themselves. Yeah, Robert, it's often too late, and you have pointed out the problem, right? We talk about it once the neighborhood's gone, and I appreciate your question.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing real quickly. I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to be very cognizant that I don't want to come off too negative or like pessimistic, and I just believe that we all have different roles, and one role is not better than the other. And I do believe in restorative justice, and I believe in people that engage in that. It's just my role or my place is a little different. So a lot of times it's just different, but it's not better or worse. And the other thing is just who is it that you rely? Where does really power reside in? And I just believe that power resides in people, and people like yourselves here. And all of you in these type of programs, it just tells me that you have a social justice framework, mindset, racial justice, and you're more open-minded than my generation. Like I'm 55, so my generation is a little bit more conservative, a little bit more racist, more homophobic, more sexist. So the only time I see future in me being optimistic and looking at your generation, or like my son, he's 23, and I see that's where the answers lie. And to organize and to believe in people, and for people to pressure government. Like the New Deal didn't come about because of FDR. It came about because there were socialists, there were anarchists, there were people protesting that demanded, rights for workers, that demanded that we end child labor, that demanded, other programs and that were in place, even public housing that I benefited from. So it's like where, and I'll just end with this: is planning is like Prairie talked about education. So planning, I should get like some money, because I always quote Prairie. There's like 1 million. He sold 1 million copies. I've only sold 10. So hopefully more people buy my book after this. Planning like education can be used for either for good to liberate people, or for bad to oppress people. So planning itself, think about it like as a tool, and what are you going to use that tool for, and on whose behalf? Like who is going to benefit? Like the marginalized or the developers, the oppressed or the oppressors. And so to me, when people work within government and are progressive and are open-minded, I'm all for that, because we all have to make a living. But it's just think about like the values. What is the value system? What is it that we're advocating for? And the plans and programs that we advocate for, at the end of the day, who do they benefit, and at what cost? And that's I really believe in people, and that's where my energies lie. But especially young people, because they're more open-minded. But I do believe planning can serve a positive role in society, and undo the harm that is done in the past and the present too.
Thank you, Dr. Huerta, for those closing remarks. They were great and really empowering. So that wraps up today's dialogue session. Thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to our speakers and respondents for your participation. Please join us for the next and last dialogue session that's next week on Thursday, October 6th from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. The topic will be property, housing, and land, pillars or barriers of restorative justice. And you can register for that event on the MAPD website. So thank you all, and have a good night.